Hi, John Morgan here with the Keep Growing podcast. And before I get started with this week's episode, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a disclaimer. And it's about my accent because it will come into play in this episode. So, a couple weeks ago, I was doing a live broadcast on Reddit, of all places. A comment that kept popping up was, "Hey dude, you have a really weird accent. Where in the heck are you from?" And, well, I live right here where Bob's is located, on the border between West Virginia and Ohio. So my accent is kind of this weird mix of West Virginia hillbilly and sort of Midwest Ohio accent. And yeah, it can be kind of weird. This past June, I went out to California, and no matter who I talked to, they were like, "Ooh, you're not from around here." So that does bring me to this episode, because the way I say the word that this episode is about might be different from how you say it, but actually when I looked it up on Wikipedia, both pronunciations are accepted. It's Christmas time, and in this episode, we're talking about poinsettias, or poinsettias. Well, no matter how you pronounce them, we're talking about them. So first, before we started talking about poinsettias, I thought we should talk about the person that they're named after, Joel Roberts Poinsett. He was an ambassador to Mexico, and he was from South Carolina. And he lived in the early 1800s. So he was born in 1791, and he died in 1851. But the time that we're kind of zeroing in on is the 1820s, when he was an ambassador in Mexico. Really, I could do an entire podcast about Poinsett. He is a really interesting guy to research. I mean, he was involved with 5 presidential administrations, and he traveled all over the world. I mean, he went to Russia, Europe, all over South America, and he also traveled all over the western frontier of the U.S., which was, well, at that time, Kentucky and Tennessee. But yeah, the dude traveled, and he also knew a lot. He was a military man, but he also was an amateur botanist. And back home in South Carolina, he had a greenhouse. So when he was in Mexico as ambassador, he was introduced to these really interesting plants that turned a fiery red color at Christmas time. Because of the red, and it's kind of a representation of the blood of Jesus, the plant became associated with Christmas. And whenever he sent them back to the U.S., they started taking cuttings from the plants and growing them, and they ended up in a few exhibitions, and they ended up getting named after him. That's why today we know them as the poinsettia instead of the Mexican flame flower, which was kind of the original name. Actually, today we have a whole holiday that's named after Poinsett. So, National Poinsettia Day. It's on the date of his death, December 12th, 1851. We have National Poinsettia Day coming up, if you're listening to this podcast right when it came out. Now that we know a little bit about where poinsettias get their name, let's take a look at their biology, because their biology is really interesting. The scientific name for poinsettias is Euphorbia pulcherrima. They are a type of euphorbia. So we grow another type of euphorbia that's a lot smaller, tinier, compact plant that has little teeny tiny white flowers on it. Same plant family, totally different plants. In the wild, poinsettias, they grow as a shrub or a small tree, and they can get up to like 15 feet tall. The blooms of a poinsettia, they really aren't blooms at all. They're actually modified leaves called bracts. So anytime you see a bract in a description of a plant, that is really just a modified leaf. And really, there's bracts all over the place in nature. Another good example that I can think of is a peace lily, where you have a modified leaf that kind of makes up part of the bloom of it. So, similar thing here with poinsettias. And early on in a poinsettia's growth, the bracts, they're all green. And it's only after they are exposed to longer periods of darkness that they start to develop their color. And that happens as the days get shorter going into wintertime. So something that we do is in September, if you have driven by our market back in September here in Mason, the greenhouse in behind it, we actually had it wrapped in black weed cloth. And that was to keep out light pollution. With that greenhouse right there next to the road, we were getting light pollution from the street lights and then also passing cars. And this year we were growing our poinsettia crop, or at least part of it in there. So we needed to stop that light pollution in order to induce the color change. So it takes about 3 weeks or so. Really, it's based on how much of the change has occurred. But once about 25 to 50% of the bracts start to change, then you've kind of started the process and they're going to, finish changing. And the colors that poinsettias can come in, there's a wide variety, but it's all kind of based off of two pigments, red and green, or the absence of those pigments. So poinsettias, they can come in red, orange, pale green, cream, pink, white. And then there's also marble varieties that are kind of a mottled mixture of white and pink, or white and red, or like a white and a light green. And then you also have some newer varieties now that also have variegation in the leaves. As I said, the leaves, the bracts, are often confused with being the flowers. So, what do the flowers actually look like on a poinsettia? Well, if you look at the very center of a poinsettia quote-unquote flower, you'll notice what looks like little tiny buds. And those little bud-like structures, they're called cyathea. And those are the flowers of the poinsettia. And it's kind of funny. I was reading greenhouse culture information on how to grow poinsettias in the greenhouse. It was talking about, like the optimal times to apply fertilizers and stuff. And it mentioned right as the buds start to open, and it described, and it looks exactly like it. And I'm going to stick a picture in the show notes. The buds go through a phase that they call the fish lips phase. And it's right when that bud starts to crack open. And by golly, it does look like fish lips. So I'm forever going to see that now when I see that out in the greenhouse after reading that description. Yeah, those are your two really cool science words of the day. Bracts and cyathea. So another fun fact is that a lot of commercially grown poinsettias that you buy are intentionally infected with a disease. There's actually a lot of plants that we purposefully infect with diseases, whether it's a bacteria or a virus or a fungus, to create a visual effect that's more appealing. And with poinsettias, we actually give them a bacterial infection. So it's a phytoplasma infection, and the main symptom is branching. So yeah, that's a beneficial thing in poinsettias, is creating multiple branches so you get a nice fuller looking plant. But it's induced through a bacterial infection, which is kind of cool. And with all the research that I did, this is the only example of a positive effect from a phytoplasma infection. That type of bacteria infects a bunch of other different types of plants, and in all of those cases, we consider it a bad thing. For example, there's one type of infection for phytoplasma in bamboo, and it creates what they call witch's broom effect. And it basically makes the bamboo branch out all over the place, and it looks like a broom. And I was also reading about how phytoplasma gets transmitted, and it's through sap sucking insects. And it's really kind of cool that they have kind of this symbiotic relationship with the bacteria, because research was done and they actually found that when plants infected with the bacteria, that the insects had a better survival rate and better reproduction rate on those plants. So yeah, I can really get out in the proverbial weeds when it comes to that. And maybe I'll get like a biologist one sometime, and we can do a whole episode about plant viruses that we kind of use to create really cool results in the horticulture industry. If you've ever watched the movie, and this is very loosely related, and it's an R-rated movie, so I don't know, you might not be into that sort of thing, but there's a movie called Tulip Fever, and it looks at a very specific historical time period in the Netherlands when tulips and the sale of tulips was going crazy. And they were looking for very specific traits in the tulips. And one of those things was a colored stripe in a perfect flower. So you've got, for example, in the movie, it's a white tulip with a single red stripe. And that's actually caused by a virus called tulip breaking virus. And there's other types of breaking viruses. There's one called Pelargonium breaking virus that infects geraniums, and it causes a similar effect, striped blooms. And likewise, there's one for New Guinea impatiens. And then there's also mosaic viruses. So probably the one mosaic virus that everyone's heard of is tobacco mosaic virus. It can infect tobacco crops and, really hurt tobacco crops. It can also infect petunias. And in petunias, it leads to a bad outcome. It can cause deformed blooms in petunias. And actually, here at Bob's, whenever we're transplanting and sticking petunias, if we have employees that are smokers, because of the possibility of cross-contamination, we actually have them wear latex gloves and use hand sanitizer to help prevent the spread of tobacco mosaic virus. There's also cucumber mosaic virus, and it leads to striped viola petals. In Abutilon, there's Abutilon mosaic virus, and it leads to mottled leaves. And there's even a poinsettia mosaic virus. And like tobacco mosaic virus, it's a bad infection. You don't want your poinsettias to get it. So it can lead to lesions on the leaves and underdeveloped bracts, which, is the bloom of the poinsettia. So yeah, that's a bad thing. There's one last thing when it comes to poinsettia biology, and it's actually a myth. And I'll include a link to a blog post that I did last year that kind of goes into detail about this. But the myth is that poinsettias are poisonous. Poinsettias are not poisonous at all. Now, I do have to do kind of a little asterisk there. They do have latex in their sap, which some people are allergic to latex. So if you break off a poinsettia leaf, the sap that comes out's kind of white and milky, and that's the latex in it. So if you're sensitive to latex and allergic to it, yeah, you might have a reaction. But for the average person, nah, poinsettias aren't poisonous at all. So where in the world did this get started? It actually can be traced all the way back to 1919. There was a little 2-year-old girl that died in Hawaii, and the parents had a poinsettia in the house, and they, I guess, just kind of put 2 and 2 together and said, yeah, poinsettia, she must have ate some, it killed her. Poinsettias are poisonous. And they really didn't do any testing or anything like that. And that's really where the whole urban legend originated. So then, in 1944, this guy was writing a book on poisonous plants, and he included poinsettias in the book based off the urban legend. Really, that's some great research there. Yeah, it gets worse. So in 1970, the FDA put in a newsletter that poinsettias were poisonous. And their source? Of course, that 1944 book. Okay. So, finally, Ohio State University, they did a test with rats where they liquefied poinsettia leaves. They basically took them, blended them up in a blender, and made poinsettia leaf concentrate that they then fed to the rats. And guess what? No ill effects. They actually increased the concentration so much that they even got up to a 500 plus leaf equivalency in the dosage that they were giving the rats. And it actually says in the report that they saw no noticeable change in the rats' behavior or their health or anything. We know that the estimate is 500 plus leaves for a 50-pound person, which that's the equivalent of about 2 pounds of sap. So, knowing all this information, last year to prove it, on a live Facebook video, I turned myself into the rat and basically replicated the experiment. And I'll include a link in the show notes to that video where I made a poinsettia smoothie and drank it. And, well, I'm sitting here today recording this podcast. So, yeah, you can take it from me quite literally that poinsettias are not poisonous. When it comes to growing poinsettias, they're pretty easy to care for. So before I get into that, I kind of wanted to tell you kind of the process that we go through before the poinsettias get to you. We grow about 80,000 poinsettias a year here at Bob's. Back, I started here 11 years ago, and back then we were growing about 8,000 poinsettias a year. So we've grown a little bit over the years. Most of that is due to wholesale sales. So our poinsettia crop, it actually starts off in June when we get cuttings in. Well, I guess really I could skip back about 6 months before that when we place the order for the cuttings. So actually, here in the next month or so, we'll be putting together the order for next Christmas's poinsettias. But anyhow, in June, we get the cuttings in, and they're shipped from El Salvador. And it's a really cool process. It just blows my mind to think about. For example, on a Monday, workers in a greenhouse in El Salvador go out and take cuttings from poinsettia mother plants. They then package up the cuttings and stick them in a cooler, and that kind of helps them sort of go dormant for shipping. It helps preserve them. It slows down their metabolism. Before they even leave the greenhouse in El Salvador, they have a U.S. Customs office on site. So they pass inspection and get loaded on a truck, head off to the airport, get on a plane. They fly into Atlanta, Georgia. Then they get loaded onto a van and driven all the way up here to West Virginia. And they could take cuttings on a Monday. And by Tuesday afternoon, we have the cuttings here in West Virginia. Which, again, it just blows my mind. So in June, we have a crew of people that stick these cuttings by hand. That's the process that we call it, is sticking, because they're literally taking the little cutting and sticking the cut stem down into the soil. And like I said, 80,000 poinsettias a year. We do them all stuck by hand. Once they stick them in soil, we move them out to the greenhouse. In the greenhouse, they get sprayed first with a solution that has a rooting hormone in it. And what that does is it helps trigger root growth where the cutting was taken. That little cut stem, it'll start to callus over and then grow roots from it. And after about 4 weeks, they're ready to be transplanted. So, first part of July, they get transplanted. And then by mid to late July, they're ready to be pinched. And what pinching does is it kind of helps them get kind of stocky, and it also helps them branch out so you get a fuller looking plant. And then once we get into September, that's when we start looking at things like light pollution, as I mentioned earlier. And that's when the color change takes place. And then in November, that's when everybody and their brother that owns a greenhouse starts calling us going, hey, what do you guys have available and what's your pricing? And that's when we start shipping out poinsettias, is in November, right around Thanksgiving. Most of the poinsettias will sell as wholesale plants, and some of them will end up in our stores. So that is getting them to the store. So how do you care for them when you get them home? Okay, poinsettias are really easy to care for. And there's a couple different routes you can go. Obviously, most people, they get a poinsettia and treat it sort of like a flower arrangement. You're just kind of nursing it through and keeping it alive until after Christmas. And then it'll end up in the compost bin. But if you're adventurous, you can actually grow your poinsettia year-round as a houseplant. Now, there are a few things that you have to do later on after Christmas, but it is a really cool challenge to try to do it. So I'm not going to get into all that. So if you check out the show notes, I'll put a link to a blog post where I go into more detail about growing poinsettias year-round. For this, let's just focus on Christmas time. So first off is light. They're a tropical plant, so they need a sunny south-facing window. And if you can't give them that, you might want to look into like a full spectrum like plant light bulb or something like that to give them a little bit of supplemental lighting. Also, with them being a tropical plant, you want to avoid any cold drafts. So they prefer temperatures in the 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit range. But the one thing that they cannot tolerate is really cold temperatures. So when you're buying your poinsettia and taking it home, here at Bob's, we put them in a plastic sleeve that kind of helps protect them. If you're buying it from another store and they don't have that, ask to get a bag or something to put down over the top of it to help protect it from the cold. Because exposing it to the cold even once can shock it. And you might notice the next day, if that happens, that it's starting to lose leaves. And it's very hard for a poinsettia to recover from that. They are really kind of fragile plants. They're susceptible to cold shock like that. So poinsettias, they are really fragile. And the leaves and stems can break really easily. So if you have small kids and pets, you might want to keep the poinsettia up and out of the way of them. I saw a poinsettia get absolutely destroyed one time. It was kind of comical. by a dog's tail. Yeah, the dog was just oblivious, wagging its tail, and took the poinsettia right out. But yeah, they are fairly brittle. So another thing is watching out for drafts. Cold drafts, of course. But if you have it setting near a heating vent, that, it can disturb it and lead to leaf drop. But also, that warm, dry air is going to suck the moisture right out of the plant. Poinsettias, they do need relatively high humidity to grow in. Something that you can do is take a tray, like a plant tray that you would set a pod on, fill it up with stones, and then add water to that and set the poinsettia on top of it. And it kind of creates a little pocket of higher humidity around the poinsettia. And that kind of leads me to the next thing, and that's watering. So you only want to water your poinsettia when the surface feels dry. And when it comes to watering, you want to water it until water drains out the bottom of the pot. And that brings me to another thing. We sell poinsettias usually in decorative foil pot wrappers. They might look pretty, but really that's just for display. So you don't want your poinsettia standing in water. You want to remove that foil covering before you water your poinsettia and wait until it's finished draining before you put that foil back on if you're going to display it in the foil. Another option is to set a saucer under it and cut holes in the foil so the water can drain out. And really, that's all there is to growing a poinsettia. So as I said, they're really simple to care for, and really they're something that anyone can purchase and enjoy. And, they make beautiful centerpieces. You can get a few different colors and mix and match and just let your imagination go wild when it comes to poinsettias and all the different varieties that we have. So again, over on the show notes page at bobsmarket.com/keepgrowing, I'll put in a gallery of some of the different varieties of poinsettias. So in this episode and the previous episode, I've talked about Christmas things, poinsettias, trees. And that's really what we do here at Bob's, is we kind of deal with the decorations and sort of the trappings of Christmas. But really, Christmas, it's a lot more than just a tree and wreaths and poinsettias and decorations. It's about getting together with family and creating memories that you'll cherish for years to come. And that brings me to this week's quote. It's from Laura Ingalls Wilder of, Little House on the Prairie. Only, the real Laura Ingalls Wilder. She said, "Our hearts grow tender with childhood memories and love of kindred, and we are better throughout the year for having, in spirit, become a child again at Christmas time." So, in closing, I'd like to say Merry Christmas from everyone here at Bob's Market. And in the new year, we wish you the best. And, of course, we want to help you continue to keep growing. And again, you can check out our show notes over at bobsmarket.com/keepgrowing. There you can also subscribe for email notifications whenever a new episode is published. So if you have questions, comments, or smart remarks, you can send those to keepgrowing@bobsmarket.com. Or if you want to leave a voice message that might just get featured in an episode, you can head over to anchor.fm/keepgrowing. And there you can also find all the different ways that you can listen to the Keep Growing podcast. And speaking of that, if you listen on iTunes, consider giving us a review. That really goes a long way toward helping other people find the podcast. And, we're a new podcast. We're still, trying to keep growing, and every little bit helps. The music in this week's episode is by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find his music over at incompetech.com, and you can find licensing information about the music used in this episode in our show notes. Copyright 2019, Bob's Market and Greenhouses, Incorporated.